So, John, why'd you write this book?
I think we're as divided as we have been since the 1850s. Imagine thinking how you wish this was like 1968. Imagine saying that sentence. A year that began with Tet, Gene McCarthy challenges Johnson so well in the New Hampshire primary. That brings Senator Kennedy, one of Evans' topics, into the race. Johnson gets out of the race on that last Sunday in March of 1968. Dr. King gives his final Sunday sermon at the Washington National Cathedral, in which he says, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be, and you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. That's the way God's universe is made. That's the way it is structured. And 4 days later, he'd be shot to death outside room 306 of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. 6 weeks after that, Senator Kennedy's killed. 6 weeks after that, the Chicago Democratic National Convention descends into chaos and violence. And on Election Day 1968, another one of Evans' guys, Nixon, wins narrowly by a single point. But George Wallace carries 13.5% of the popular vote and 5 states in the Electoral College. So I thought for 4 or 5 years that this was a moment of immense chaos like that, and that things would come back together in kind of a hopefully self-correcting way. I don't think that's necessarily true. And if it's not 1968, tragically then it may have to be the 1850s. And the 1850s were marked by, see if any of this sounds familiar, as Mark Twain is reported to have said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. That there is a vociferous, largely geographically concentrated, ideologically driven group of Americans who live in their own reality, who choose their own religious interpretations, who choose their own constitutional interpretations, and put their own aristocracies of race and economics above the constitutional journey toward a more perfect union. And so what I wanted to know with Lincoln is it fell to Lincoln to adjudicate this. And it turns out Lincoln's been written about. I was misinformed. I thought I was sort of breaking news. Binky was excited. It was going to be great. We were going to do it all. Walter's interview with Lincoln, by the way, was really good. That was useful when he did that Amanpour episode. Walter said, live from Springfield. So that was good. That takes care of coming back next year. So I just took care of that. I knew how he did it. What I wanted to know was why. Because I believe we're in a moral crisis at this hour in the country. And by moral, it's not a Sunday school thing. It's more, the origin of the word moral is how we are with each other. Mores, right? And if we don't see each other as fellow citizens, then it doesn't work. If we don't give as well as take, it doesn't work. And so we have to see each other as neighbors. And that's a moral decision we make. And then the complexities, an old cliche from our world, then the hard part. But without seeing each other as fellow members of a covenant and a contract, democracy, which is incredibly counterintuitive anyway, doesn't work. Now, I just said neighbors, and I need to be careful about that, because here's a quick story about a very small category called great tweets. It's like French military victories in the 20th century, right? It doesn't take long. About 6 months ago, somebody tweeted that if Doris Kearns Goodwin and Mr. Rogers had had a one-night stand, I would have resulted. And I thought it was great, right? Doris was kind of pissed off. So she learned how to use the cell phone, and it rang, you know. And she said, no, did you see this? I said, I did, Mom. And that pissed her off more. And you don't want to piss Doris off. So she said, this is a true story, she said, you know, why couldn't Mr. Rogers and I have fallen in love and you were the fruit of our union? I said, no, sweetheart, he picked you up in the C-SPAN bar. So anyway, Lincoln, we're talking about Lincoln? How did he do it? Why did he do it? And the why. And anti-slavery was not a good political position. He kept losing. When he became president, it was with 39%. And so he was, I believe he was genuine when he said, I am naturally anti-slavery. I do not remember when I did not so think and feel. And so I wanted to know why.
So this book is saturated with religion. And
as is life.
well, not so much, actually. I mean, one of the issues to me reading this book was Lincoln lived at a time that was saturated with religion. People read the Bible, they knew the Bible, they talked religion. That's not true of our day,
right,
so much. And so I'm interested how you brought us from his world that is saturated with religion into our world. How do you make that, if you're writing for an audience that lives in a essentially secular
yeah,
world,
yeah.
how do you do that? And how does your own experience play into that?
No, it's a great question. Look, I'm sure you all are better people than I am. That's not hard, so don't congratulate yourself. But I know that if I do the right thing 51% of the time, that's a hell of a good day, and I don't have many of them. And so, therefore, I understand why the country gets so much wrong, because a democracy ultimately is the fullest manifestation of our habits of heart and mind. And Robert Louis Stevenson once said that the duty of a Christian is not to succeed, but to fail cheerfully. And if so, that's the only definition under which I'm good at it. I believe that you don't need 90% of something. If you've taken pains to be here, A, Walter just made you, so that's good. But B, I suspect this may resonate with you. We don't need to lament the state of the country anymore. We got it. We just need to lead our way out of it, right? We understand. And I believe that a religious sensibility, and I don't care what you call it, it doesn't have to be, it's just a moral sensibility. But for most people in American history, as you say, it's been biblically based. I think that's the beginning of democratic, lowercase d, mores, because it's based on the dignity and sanctity of the individual. And without that, we are cast into a Hobbesian war of all against all. And the whole struggle between democracy and dictatorship, you know, from Roosevelt forward, Wilson forward, is about the relative role of the individual to the state. And if the state is more important than the individual, then whoever controls the state controls everything. And that's fundamentally unbiblical. A biblical understanding of history is that there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? We've had the beginning, we're in the middle, and a religious understanding of this is that what we do in the middle will be rewarded or punished at the end. And that's what Abraham Lincoln thought, and Frederick Douglass thought, and Henry Highland Garnet thought. And so I think it's a useful way for us to think about why we should be in a democratic covenant with each other. And you don't have to agree. Most people don't. Look, I'm a boringly heterosexual white Southern male Episcopalian, right? And some of those things are redundant. Things work out for me in this country, right? I'm fine. The point of America, though, is that everybody's supposed to be fine.
So Lincoln spoke this way. I mean, his second inaugural is just is biblical verse. People talk that way. They read that way. They don't do that today. You're doing it right now, but that's not our discourse today.
Are you suggesting that I'm not like Beyonce power here? I'm shocked. I'm with Jefferson on this. Jefferson didn't believe the stuff particularly, but he spoke this way because he thought that he saw a certain Republican, lowercase r, utility to it. I disagree, Evan, a little bit. I think if you don't appeal to people's better nature and self-interest, you're done. So here's a story about which you know that I think captures this. This is about George Herbert Walker Bush. So I wrote a book about President Bush. It took 17 years. It was supposed to be posthumous, but the son of a bitch wouldn't die. I'd bring it up. He'd say, "Not gonna do it." Totally. Dana Carvey once said the key to doing his voice was Mr. Rogers trying to be John Wayne. It's a perfect description. But it's right. So he was at Greenwich Country Day School in the middle of the 1930s. There was an annual obstacle course race at Greenwich Country Day School. One of his classmates was named Bennett McNichol. Bennett McNichol was a fairly rotund lad. That's key to the story. He had not paid attention to Mrs. Obama's school lunch program, right? So they go off, and Bush always wins, so the faculty asked him, he was getting ready to go off to Andover, it was his last year. They said, "Would you give everybody else a head start?" And so Bush said, "Sure." So everybody goes off, and then Bush goes. And he's going through a series of barrels on the ground, and he comes out, and he looks to his right, and Bennett McNichol is stuck in the barrel, right? Moment of maximum adolescent terror. You're the heavy kid, you're stuck in the barrel, the most popular boy in the school is looming over you. So what does Bush do? He reaches down, he pulls him out, he says, "Come on, Bennett, we'll finish this together." Biggest moment of Bennett McNichol's life, right? Kind of the story that a presidential family would tell about the greatness of their chieftain, right? But I didn't hear it from a Bush. I heard it from a McNichol, because the guy told the story for 60 years. And so I took it to President Bush. I said, "Sir, I just heard this story about Bennett McNichol." And the first thing the old man said was, "Bennett, he loved lunch." I said, "No, no." "Not the point, sir." Says, "He's still big?" I said, "Sir, let's move on." I said, "Why'd you pull him out of the barrel?" Right, jackass biographer question to ask. And he looked at me as if I were crazy. And he said, "Well, I'd never been stuck in a barrel, but if I had been, I'd want somebody to pull me out. You idiot, you know?" Notice what he didn't say. He didn't say, "I pulled him out because the Bible told me so. I pulled him out because my mother taught me to be nice." He extended a hand because he might need a hand. And however you make that argument, if the American Republic's going to long endure, that argument has to prevail.
So you think we still have these assumptions and these
I think
biblically rooted?
I think just enough of us do, and that's what America is just enough of us wanting to do the right thing just enough of the time. You know, we have this debate about 1619 versus 1776. My view is that we were founded in 1965, right? I don't need to tell anybody in Louisiana that, right? The first integrated electorate in the United States of America was 1968. We're a half century old. And so there's not this mythic Brigadoon of where, you know, Brookings meets Brigadoon where everybody got along. There's just not. You know that better than I do. But yes, I think that the results of since we're talking about this now, the results of the 2020 election and the results of the 2022 election suggest that just enough of us don't want to be crazy. Just enough. Just enough.
There's a heroic vision of the future.
Yeah, and I'm selling that with coffee mugs later. But that really is it, right? The fact that Joe Biden is president means that just enough of us.
So back to Lincoln. He was constantly juggling political expediency
Yeah.
and his own conscience. Walk us through that a little bit about how he did that balancing act.
Well, he was, don't listen to me, listen to Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass in 1876 spoke at the dedication of the Freedmen's Monument in Washington on Capitol Hill. Monument entirely built to Lincoln by the funds of the emancipated. And it's a very profound, it's the most profound document about what we do for a living I've ever read. It's about biography, it's about history. I fully commend it, as George W. would say, get it on the Google machine. He says, Douglass says, Lincoln was preeminently the white man's president. We were his children by adoption at best. As a statesman of a nation whose opinion he was bound to consult, nevertheless, we saw that the hour of our deliverance had met in this man in this moment. And so my view of Lincoln, which is somewhat counter to both a sort of an anti-Lincoln tradition, is that he was not late to the anti-slavery cause. And you all know this. Everybody in the 19th century who was anti-slavery was not necessarily an abolitionist. Every abolitionist was anti-slavery, right? And so this is complicated. Slavery was a state institution. And so the entire Civil War came because it was about growth. It was about and believe me, New Orleans was part of this. It was about the white South's, my people, ambition to create a slave-based empire that would be both in the western United States, Kansas and New Mexico, Arizona, California come in as a free state, but it was also about moving south. It was about moving into the Gulf. It was about taking Cuba. Remember the Golden Circle, Knights of the Golden Circle? The center of the Golden Circle was going to be a slave-based empire. It was going to be Havana. And 4 presidential administrations into Lincoln had tried to annex Cuba because it was this immense jewel of possible enslaved wealth built on the enslaved. And so we know where the border is, but if you lived in the 19th century, that sucker moved all the time. Right? The country had doubled in 1805, 1850, California had come in, Northwest Territory was being operated. I mean, things moved fast. And so it was a much more tactile issue for people. And Lincoln built his entire campaign in 1860 on the fact that slavery could not move into unorganized territory. That was the tug, as he called it. And I think the bravest thing he ever did, one of the bravest things he did, and it's interesting to me that it's kind of lost to the popular mind, was in 1860-61. He wins the presidency, and the senator from Kentucky, James Crittenden, proposes a compromise. Just out of curiosity, the Crittenden Compromise is familiar to... Okay. We're going to work on this. Very quickly. So he's a senator from Kentucky. He's ancient in those terms. Longtime official. It was the kind of compromise that people like us would have sat on television and said, well, you know, there's a lot to recommend this. You know, it might answer the competing interests of the country. Here's what it was. He was going to reinstitute the Missouri Compromise line, take it across to the eastern border of California, allow slavery to take root in New Mexico and Arizona, and avoid civil war. Charles Francis Adams was for this. 20,000 merchants in New York sent a petition to Washington in favor of it. The former presidents, there were about 6 of them, were for it. Lincoln said no. Seward was for it. So the second most powerful Republican in the country would have done this. Think about what would have happened, right? It was the most rational kind of thing you could do. You know, Adams's position from Massachusetts was you can't have plantations in New Mexico and Arizona, so why not? Lincoln saw the principle, which is that if he gave in, if slavery went into territory that was controlled by the Congress, it was like Hitler in 1940. It was a final act of irreversible appeasement. And he writes this. He writes a letter saying, if we do this, next year it's Cuba, and then it's Nicaragua, and then it's Terra del Fuego. He said it will never end. I believe if Abraham Lincoln had taken that compromise, slavery would have endured in the United States into the 20th century. I'm convinced of that. So my question, and this is one of the reasons I did this. Initially, I was kind of thinking maybe I just do a book about the winter, that winter. Why? Why stand on that principle then? Because as a politician, it's the deal you take. And if you see someone entirely as a politician, there's always a reason to do the opposite. And my answer was, as sentimental as it may sound, and this is not the Mr. Rogers shtick, I promise, was he believed slavery was wrong and should not be extended. And he had won an election on that, and he wasn't going to concede. And without that, we live in a different country. And so, now, did he wait 20 months on emancipation? Yes. Was he not he was not an egalitarian. We can talk about that, obviously. But his anti-slavery credentials are pure, I believe. And there's a pro-Lincoln argument, which is that he grew in office. Now, grew in office in Washington, as Evan knows, is code for he came to agree with me. Right? That's what that means. So, he's really grown. I mean, okay. And there's a line of this in Lincoln that he was growing, right? That he'd been slow to emancipation. He'd been tardy, the word Douglas used. Okay, but put yourself in that office on the second floor of the White House. It's now the Lincoln bedroom. And think about, what would you have done? Right? You have these huge border states that might take up arms against you. You damn near lose the war anyway. You've got people around you who don't want to take this to the ultimate extreme at that moment. Seward and Winfield Scott didn't want to make the stand at Sumter either. And I think all in all, he didn't grow so much as he met each moment. And I think he did it because of this moral conviction that slavery was wrong.
So he was rooted and grounded in that, but he was an emotionally complicated guy. He suffered from depression. Help us with that. Somebody who's that religion may not be familiar to people, but depression is. And
there are those of us who've done both.
How did he deal with his own depression? And how did that affect his...
Poorly. I think about this all the time, don't you? I mean, think about the millennia of human experience without pharmaceuticals. Seriously. Think of the darkness that people suffered. And, Churchill drank and painted, and Lincoln was suicidal at times. He kept falling in love and losing women, and that'll do it. And so there were fears. His friends took his razors away at one point in the 1840s. I think he, as everyone did in that era, he had to endure. He didn't drink, didn't smoke, unusually. Doesn't seem to have stepped out on Mary. That would have been a very dangerous thing to have done. I think he found solace, I believe, in this exploration of why are we here and why are we doing this? And there's a cliche in the annals of the White House about Lincoln allegedly said, "I have often gone to my knees to pray because I had nowhere else to go. He didn't say that, but the point is largely there. I think he was trying to figure out why this was happening. Lost his son, they lost Willie, they lost two children, Eddie early and Willie in February 1862. Immense grief. And I also had not fully appreciated, one of the things that interested me was the war so remote from us now, right? Lincoln was the commander-in-chief and could smell gunpowder when there was action in Northern Virginia, right? Could hear the cannon. The Union put cannon on the heights of Arlington because they were afraid the Confederates would hit the White House. I mean, this was right there. In April of '61, he lost someone who'd been on his staff in action in Alexandria. So it was real. It was right there. And of course, Mary had kinfolk on the other side, right? So this was all quite immediate. We now think, demographers now think that 750,000 people died during the war. We used to think it was 600,000. And imagine being in the seat of responsibility with this rising tide of blood. And I think he was trying to figure out why. And where he landed was, I think, articulated by the most profound theological statement any American president ever made, which was in the second inaugural. He said, "It may be that every ounce of blood drawn by the lash must be answered by an ounce of blood drawn by the sword. And if that be true, then let it be said," quoting the psalmist, "then the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether." Wow. Sit with that for a second. An American president is saying that there is a God who is so attentive to the issues and realities of a given geographical polity that he's measuring bloodshed in order to see whether we have expiated a sin. And Frederick Douglass is standing down to his right, Lincoln's right. And like all speech makers, Lincoln wanted a compliment from another speech maker. So later that day, he said to Douglass, "What'd you think of the speech?" And Douglass said, "Mr. Lincoln, that was a sacred effort." But to give you some sense of the complexity of the issues we're talking about, Douglass was nearly ejected from the White House by a racist policeman who was guarding the White House, who didn't think that blacks should come in. On Saturday, March 4th, 1865. That day tells you everything about the complexity of the country.
Let's talk for a little bit about how you choose your subjects.
Yeah.
How do you choose your subjects?
33 years. You all know one of the reasons, I should quickly say, one of the reasons I'm sitting here is because of Evan and Walter. When I won't tell you how old I was, but I was not wildly old when Evan and Walter published The Wise Men, one of the great books ever. And yes, clap. Vital. And so I was in high school, and it came out, and I read it, and I loved it so much that I finished it and then read it again. Years later, when I met Evan for the first time, and I was interviewing for a job, I told him this story. And Evan looked at me with that really kind of avuncular way and said, "You must have been a real loser." So here we are, my friend. It was like most questions Evan asked, it was true. I mean, it was true, I was. But I picked the subjects. I have three tests. One, is there a resonance now? And there are biographers who disagree with this, and there's history that's history, and that's fine. I want to be able to make arguments and try to shed light on what's unfolding. Not in a presentist way, but I just want it to be part of a conversation. That's one. Secondly, is there an angle of vision an argumentative thing that separates where the scholarly or the popular conversation is. And third, is there some new archival edition that I can put in the bloodstream? And in the Lincoln case, interestingly, it turned out to be the Southern archives, white Southern archives, many of which were actually at my alma mater, the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee. There may be one or two of you who don't know it well. It's best understood as a combination of Downton Abbey and Deliverance. But it's got really good Confederate archives. And the view, and you read it's chilling. It is chilling to read the secessionist literature. And I don't need to tell you why, right? It's right here. And these forces are perennial. And so what I want to do is, and I don't think, our old friend Arthur Schlesinger used to say that history can be a diagnostic guide. I think that's right. I don't think it's a GPS. I don't think you plug in systems and get there.
Do you have to like your subjects?
I tend to, yeah. You know, I get accused of this. Like President Bush, for instance. I didn't fall in love with him, but I came to love him. And there's a difference. And I don't make any, I mean, people can read my book or not read my book. It's up to them. I explicitly wrote a book that was actually against the basic theme which we have, which is, what amazes me about people is, in history, that almost everyone that I've written about and that you've written about, is not that they got so much right, but that they got anything right. But what they got right, they got at a critical moment. And they transcended their fallibility and frailties. And to me, that's hopeful. Because I'm a miserable guy. And they're pretty miserable too, and they did great things, so maybe we can too. I explicitly did the book about John Lewis as a separate thing. Most of the people I write about are sinners who managed to do a saintly thing. Congressman Lewis was a saint who sinned a couple of times. And so that was explicitly a work of hagiography.
Is faith necessary for transcendence?
No. No, well, faith in the religious faith?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so. I think Tillich had a great term. You just need an ultimate concern, a goal beyond yourself. And for many of us, that is linked to a divinely charged thing, but conscience and duty just have to be rooted in something outside yourself, but it doesn't have to be godly.
So what things outside ourselves right now can people latch on to?
This gets to self-interest. It's memory, right? How do we want to be remembered in this hour? Who here wouldn't have wanted to have been on the right side of the civil rights movement at this point? Right? This is a somewhat diverse crowd, but not stunningly. Right? So that's self-interest, right? What do you want the world to say about you? I feel incredibly lucky in so many different ways, personally, professionally, but also just to be born a citizen of the United States of America in the last part of the 20th century is an amazing gift. And unless you are totally warped and selfish, there has to be some, to my mind, we all have the capacity to want to build and not tear down. to leave things stronger than weaker. And we are in danger, you and I, of leaving democracy weaker than we found it. And I wouldn't have said that 6, 7 years ago.
We have time for some questions. There's a mic. Come on up.
When you started your research, did you go from Gore Vidal? Did you read Gore Vidal, Lincoln?
I didn't on purpose. I'd read it years ago. I try to avoid, and I didn't rewatch Doris and Spielberg's movie. I try to avoid imaginative literature when I'm doing this, just so it doesn't complicate things.
But did you go into also reading about John Hay and what he wrote with his?
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Is there a way to get that for anybody could read the entire 10 volumes of John Hay?
I have those 10 volumes. They loom over me. They're really good.
That's what I've been trying to find it to read.
Oh, to find them. Oh.
And
okay.
I cannot find
Amazon
it anywhere to read.
Amazon?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a very technical thing, but I bought some reprint off Amazon. I get the people I buy books from on Amazon are like very lonely, I think. I love them, if you're watching. But I get stuff like, wrapped in used bubble wrap. That's a pretty...
Thank you.
Used bubble wrap. You just have like a musky smell.
Good morning, Mr. Meacham, sir.
Dave, how are you?
I'm fine. Evan, nice to see you after 15 years. Reading the book, there was I believe it had to do with colonialization, the concept of moving emancipated blacks to someplace outside of the country. And I believe you expressed a personal discomfort with the words that Lincoln used. And if I don't have the right particular moment, it's not all that important. My question is, where are you on the concept of presentism?
Oh, just so we're clear, you define presentism as you're asking the question.
Imparting today's values to people who lived 150, 200 years ago.
So the good news about opposing colonization is you don't have to impose your values because people opposed it then. And I do try to, in writing about Andrew Jackson or Jefferson or Lincoln or FDR and Japanese internment, whatever it may be, I try to find the voices of protest within the time itself and try to judge where was opinion then. But opinion, and I think you'll see, there were plenty of people who rightly saw that colonization, the removal of remember this was the respectable, quote unquote, opinion for 50 years in the United States. James Madison and James Monroe were presidents of the American Colonization Society, and the plan was emancipate, compensate the slave owners, and then remove freed blacks, right? So let's not be sentimental about this. The notion of a multi-ethnic democracy like the one we have now is a relatively recent phenomenon. And so, and I think we have to be relentlessly honest about the failings of the American experiment if in fact that experiment is going to have the capacity to correct itself. Because if you don't acknowledge a problem, how do you correct it?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Morning.
In the spirit of quam parva sapientia mundus regitur, and from a safe historian seat, how do you see our situation with China? Will our descendants have to pick up arms? Where do you see this going? And I know it's looking forward.
I'm sorry.
Sorry. Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
China?
How do you see our relationship with China, looking forward from a safe historian seat, will we, our descendants, have to pick arms?
Oh, take arms. I know almost nothing. So this is just a citizen's opinion. I think that what's unfolding in Ukraine is vital. I think if the West were to fail this test of will between dictatorship and democracy, I think that would send a devastating and demoralizing signal, and it would embolden autocratic powers around the world to try to do what Putin's doing. And how that applies exactly to the Chinese example is way beyond my expertise. But do I believe war is inevitable, as some people argue with China? No. I don't believe anything's inevitable in human experience, except that we'll probably make a lot of mistakes.
Okay. You alluded to this very briefly, but Lincoln, as most abolitionists or who did not want slavery, except for maybe a small handful, were in fact not egalitarians. They did not believe in the equalness. How do you envision that with the religious part of what you're talking about?
It's a great question, and there are moments when you do this, and Evan knows this feeling, where you want to reach back and grab your subject by the scruff of the neck and say, why can't you see what you should do here? Egalitarianism was not predominant in the United States of the 19th century. I think that the abolitionist group, which in England I believe started it, which came up with the phrase, "Am I not a man and a brother?" was brilliant. That's a hashtag, right? Because it goes straight to a passage from Acts. God hath made of one blood all the nations of the world, and there can be no distinctions of color or creed or nationality. I don't see how, and yet Lincoln did, I don't see how you could have the interpretation he did of human nature and of the Declaration of Independence and not get to an egalitarian position, which is where we've gotten broadly. I wish they'd gotten there faster. But I'm a big believer. I screw things up all the time. I fall short all the time. And so I'm not going to judge overly harshly. Call it as you see it, but I'm not going to pound on them.
I have a second part to that, and that's the Emancipation Proclamation was really a political move more than it was a moral, this is what we need to get rid of type of thing.
No, I don't agree.
Okay.
And I killed a lot of trees explaining why.
I haven't read it yet, so.
Okay, well, read it and you can attack my view on the Emancipation Proclamation. It was a military document, but it was a vital step.
We have 30 seconds.
Yes, I got it. I have a question about racial diversity. Look at this crowd. There are not many African Americans here. Just wanted to say that I'm a typical example of the American dream. Came here 13 years ago, went to school, teach math and science. There is still a lot of potential in this country. You can still make it in this country, but I'm going to borrow this question from Arnold Rampersad, another historian, I admire a lot. He said, how do you maintain your sanity in this society? How do you become a productive member of this society? How do you realize your complete potential as a human being when you're dealing constantly with something that seems almost undefeatable, which is racism and racial profiling? Thank you.
It's a marvelous question. It's the central question of what is the democratic, lowercase d, undertaking? Are we a country that will live up to and into the promise that we voluntarily made at the beginning? And that's the central question. That was the central claim in the most famous, most important sermon ever preached in the United States, which was Dr. King on Wednesday, August 28th, 1963. Told, by the way, made perfect in its way because of the voice of a woman. Do y'all know this? King was losing the audience. 200,000 people. It was hot, late in the day. And the original sermon wasn't going hugely well. People weren't paying a lot of attention. Mahalia Jackson was standing behind him. And she said, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream." It's like the women at the tomb of Jesus. It was a woman's voice that changed everything. And he goes into the riff. And what's the claim of the dream, which you alluded to wonderfully? And thank you. You teach?
Yes, math and science.
God bless you. I was not good at that, so let's just stick to the history for a second. All right? The claim is live up to the promise. And we're going to fail, but we can't stop trying. Thank you for what you do.
Thank you,
so
John.
much.